This is Melissa, and it is the 20th of October, 2024. I hope everyone is doing all right. I wanted to mention that the Tragedy and Hope Book Club, our last conversation we had live in the chat room, was on the 12th of October, which was a week ago Saturday. I had a busy week, but I was able to get the first half of that conversation illustrated and up on the channels and website yesterday on the 19th, Saturday. We've had some volunteers. Darren and I will be taking chapter 15, and we will convene on that one in the chat room next Saturday, the 26th, and then volunteers are taking chapter 16 in November, and I think I have another volunteer helping me with chapter 17. So anyone who is reading along and participating, please feel free to step up, contact me or Darren or Andrea in the Telegram site, and just express an interest in taking on a chapter. That would be great. The Redux that I chose to go up is the first hour. I haven't cut it yet, but I'm guessing it'll be about the first hour of a talk that Alan gave August 23, 2020. CONology on Parade with Masters Who Persuade. The con within CONology, perfected by psychology, has the targets participate in prearranged fate, tempted by fodder like lambs to the slaughter, or terrified of dying, give power to the lying, led into circumstances where they ought not to be. I have used this talk you become accustomed to something, and then slowly over time they change it, they whittle it away, they make it smaller, they make it less, and I know that you've all seen countless examples of this kind of con in marketing and consumer products. I'll say here that I will have to edit a bit of this, of what Alan says, because let's just remember the year is 2020, so he's going to be talking about some things that are just scary. Can't let you hear that. You might start thinking for yourself. And also because the things that come out of my mouth, no matter how careful I am, I find also are not acceptable. I'm going to talk a little bit now, and some of you, some places, aren't going to hear it. So I'll just dive in and speak frankly now. In this first hour that Alan is talking, he talks about how robots might be used, might be turned on you. He said it was a documentary that's about rioting and protests and how those things might be managed. And he'd seen something that showed them a company that was already getting their bids in to put robots on the street. And he said, so what is are you going to debate with a robot? You know, do you think that the robot is going to listen to you talk, or cares about your emotions or what you've suffered or your mental state? You know, that's the kind of sci-fi future where the cops and enforcers are robots, but we already live fully immersed, those of us who have any kind of digital interaction, in a world that is more or less artificially run. It's run by artificial intelligence. And an example I mentioned a few weeks ago, I put up a real history where I was reading about these. And I mention this again today because of two stories that were in the news that I wanted to share with you, because Alan does talk about euthanasia in this first hour of this talk. This is from the Daily Mail. We wouldn't treat animals like this. Labour MP reveals why she's pushing new laws on assisted dying in what could be an historic Commons vote, and says speaking to Esther Ranson stiffened her resolve. Now, the Labour MP is Kim Ledbetter, and she is saying that the current law is not fit for purpose, and there's so many heartbreaking stories about people who are suffering at the end of their lives, and they need a better, she said here, we give our animals a better send-off than we do some human beings. So the bill that she has put forward is titled Choice at the End of Life for Terminally Ill Adults. But she's already receiving backing from somebody or other who said this, I think it might be Lord Falconer, said this could give, well, I don't have that article up, it's a different article and I'll find that and post it, but Lord Falconer is basically already widening the parameters, so it's not just about people who are terminally ill, because that's where they went in Canada. The statistics around what has happened in Canada over the last few years since they've had their MAID, which is medical assistance in dying, is pretty grim. So I wanted to share that with you, but I wanted to find out who Kim Ledbetter was. And then I realized that there was absolutely no coincidence that she is the one who is putting forth this bill, because she is the sister of the late MP Joe Cox. And in fact, she ran in Joe Cox's, I don't know what they call I think they're called ridings, your district in the UK. So some of you, especially those in the UK, may remember that Joe Cox was brutally murdered in 2016, I think. She was shot and she was stabbed multiple times by someone described as a right-wing with white supremacist with ties to U.S. neo-Nazi groups. And he also stabbed an elderly man who came to Joe Cox's rescue, tried to help her, and he ended up being stabbed in the stomach, and so he suffered a severe injury. And the man that was doing this was yelling "Britain first" as he was stabbing her, and she died from her wounds. So her sister is putting forth this medical assistance in dying bill, kind of dying with dignity. We wouldn't treat our animals this way. But I don't follow politics in my own country, let alone the UK, so I looked around for a little bit more info on her. And her big win in 2021, first of all, she was endorsed on the campaign trail by Keir Starmer, who's now the Prime Minister. And he was saying at the time of that win in 2021, Labour is back. So I think that Kim Ledbetter is one to watch. And I just say that it was natural for her to put this forward, because I would think that people criticizing it will feel compelled to be quite careful about their commentary, that it not be too inflammatory or emotional. Right after that I stumbled upon that story, someone sent me another story that originated in the Independent newspaper in the UK. But this is a story about a U.S. man. Kentucky man's organs were nearly harvested. Then doctors realized he was still alive. The patient allegedly mouthed the words, "Help me," ahead of the organ retrieval procedure. So doctors were about to harvest his organs and then made the startling discovery that he was still alive. There was someone named Natasha Miller, who is an organ preservationist. Sorry. I might think that was someone who was salvaging pipe organs in ancient churches, but no. Okay, so she said he was moving around, kind of thrashing around on the bed, said Natasha Miller, an organ preservationist. in the operating room during the alarming October 2021 incident. Now, this just came out in the news a couple of days ago, so I'm not sure why, why they're releasing it now, but 3 years later we're hearing about it. When we went over there, you could see he had tears coming down. He was crying visibly. Miller, who works at Kentucky Organ Donor Affiliates, CODA, which is another interesting acronym because a coda is spelled differently. The concluding passage of a composition, like the final musical movement, or the ending part of a statement. But anyway, that's where she works. She works at CODA. The procuring surgeon, he was like, I'm out of it. I don't want to have anything to do with it. It was very chaotic and everyone was upset. Well, just think about it. I mean, even that from the surgeon saying, I'm out of it. I don't want to have anything to do with it. Well, of course you don't want to have anything to do with it. The man is still alive. It's just a bizarre story. The patient was 36-year-old Anthony Thomas T.J. Hoover II, and he had been admitted to the hospital from a drug overdose. And his sister Donna Rohrer told the outlet that there was a flicker of concern when her brother was being taken into the intensive care unit, from the intensive care unit to an operating room. She recalled seeing him open his eyes, which then began darting around the room. It was like it was his way of letting us know, hey, I'm still here. Now, you see what I'm saying? The story is bizarre because at that point, why doesn't someone, how did she see him going from intensive care to the operating room? But in the operating room, Miller, the CODA lady, recalled the case coordinator phoning her supervisor at CODA for help once they saw signs of life. The supervisor insisted that the case coordinator needed to find another doctor to do it. Ultimately, the organ retrieval was canceled. Hoover now lives with Rohrer, his legal guardian. I'll post the rest of the article, but I think Alan talks about voting, again, as an example of participating in our own cons that are run against us, participating in the deception. So I'll just say don't vote and don't put yourself down as an organ donor. On the side of the thing that came in about that article, there was something from People magazine. And I haven't looked at People for years. I just remember it from my childhood as being, kind of human interest stories, some of them thinly disguised as news. But when I looked at it yesterday, it was just a shocking series of seedy crimes and horrible, depressing, awful stories. Just a terrible thing. That I saw this here. Doctor's license suspended after being accused of performing sex acts while staff watched. Now, this story just broke a couple of days ago. We don't know what's going to happen to him. His license has been suspended. Will it be revoked altogether? Why were staff watching this in the first place? It's just a bizarre story, but everything about People magazine was lowest common denominator. And it made me think about something that I've thought about before. Alan has shared some really dark stories over the years of people who have done horrific, torturous, terrible things to animals, to children, to each other. He didn't bring those to you all the time, to be sure, but he did share those from time to time. And whenever I read or hear or heard him talk about those stories, I always wondered, what is going on in the mind of a woman who drowns a baby, for instance? not so much what is going on, and they'll say, oh, it's postpartum depression or what, whatever, any number of things might be offered up as a reason for the action. But my question is always, how does someone live with themselves when they do something horrible, something evil? How do they live with themselves? And it got me thinking about the concept that has been written about and discussed in psychology for many, many years, which is rationalization. Rationalization is it's a self-deceptive defense mechanism. It's basically, you might call it mental gymnastics. It's lying to yourself. And usually rationalization happens almost immediately because your ego wants you to see things a certain way. People don't want to live with things that might make them experience self-loathing or enormous regret or to hate themselves or the ego wants to fool you into believing that you're okay. You didn't do anything wrong. Now, justification happens after that. The justification is what you tell other people. So, the justification, the story, one of the stories that I saw on this painful foray into People magazine was a man, a youngish man who had choked his 1-year-old to death because he said the baby would not listen to him. So this is a justification for what he did. I killed the baby because the baby wouldn't listen to me. But somewhere before that is the rationalization that went on in his head, and it might have been immediately. So rationalization is very often making something for which there can be no rational explanation seem rational to the person who is involved in self-deception and lying to themselves. And I think that rationalization is an interesting concept to consider in all of the ways that we go along with the cons that are perpetrated on us, and how we go along with new normals, which really aren't normal. There's nothing normal about so much of the cultures that continue to disintegrate around us. But we accept it and we accept it and we accept it. And it's a collective action. And the result of the world that we see out there is the collective result of a lot of self-deception. So Alan was always big on look at yourself, because in little ways we all deceive ourselves. When I was in the independent newspaper, I saw another little story there that I clicked on. Americans are addicted to gambling on the election because it's finally legal, sort of. Is election betting good fun, civic engagement, or a threat to democracy itself? Asks Josh Marcus. And then the story begins. People can't get enough of betting on the 2024 presidential election, and thanks to a recent legal ruling, it's easier than ever for Americans to vote with their wallet. On Polymarket, one of the top online exchanges, people have already spent over $1.2 billion betting on the U.S. presidential election. That includes 2 mystery individuals betting millions on a Trump win. Betting market odds are suddenly on the lips of U.S. broadcasters and campaign spin doctors, quoted like polls and watched like the weather. Betting on elections has long been prohibited in the U.S., but various exchanges and their users have found ways to get in on the action nonetheless. Now, this article to me reads like a how-to on how to do it and how to get around prohibitions in the U.S. And you can read it if you have time or interest, and you might see what I see or not. But it isn't, there's no moral indictment, there's no discussion of whether or not, he asks the question, is this good fun civic engagement or a threat to democracy itself? But really, what you're seeing is, how do I do it? How do I get in on some of that action? And it got me thinking about who is running for president, and the fact, just speaking of betting, the Trump casinos, which as far as I know, they're all bankrupt and defunct now or owned by other people, but just a little remembering that one of Trump's first things in about the first decade of his taking over the family business was the building of the so-called hospitality industry. So lots of gambling, lots of betting. What you have here is a showman. A showman. Winners and losers. And who wants to be a loser? Winners are rich. Winners take risks. Winners gamble. And they always win. That's what we're shown. And that reminds me of a documentary that Alan has mentioned to us a time or two, and I mentioned it not that long ago, from 1995, called Spin. Spin is a documentary film by Brian Springer composed of raw satellite feeds featuring politicians' pre-appearance planning. It covers the presidential election as well as the 1992 Los Angeles riots and the Operation Rescue abortion protests. It's very interesting. I mentioned recently that Alan actually recommended this to me before I met him, and we had a long conversation about how spin is done. And Alan mentions, I don't think he mentions this documentary anywhere in this talk, but he does talk about how things are spun for you by politicians. And just the other day, I randomly stumbled on an interview from 1973, just a couple of minutes, with Martha Mitchell. Martha Mitchell was the wife of John Mitchell. He was an attorney general in the Watergate era, attorney general under Nixon, and he went to prison. He may well be the only American attorney general who's ever gone to prison, but that was John Mitchell. She was married to him. Martha Mitchell was also called the Mouth of the South, and she was a character. She really was a character. Now, I think she thought of herself as a whistleblower. I think it has been famously said by Nixon himself that there would not have been a Watergate investigation, trials, impeachment. None of that would have happened without Martha Mitchell. But in this 2-minute clip, Martha Mitchell is walking down some sidewalk, I think, or standing somewhere with sunglasses on. And she is saying that the American public just don't know that what they see whenever they see politicians talking, or she said if you look at a Senate hearing, she said the Senate hearing is rehearsed. It is, as she said, it's not a spontaneous conversation like you and I are having right now. It is as rehearsed as a Broadway play. And the American people have no idea about that. So I think that more or less sums up anything that was on my mind to bring to you today. I hope that you have a good week and that some of you will be able to join in to the next Tragedy and Hope Book Club conversation that we have next Saturday. I think we're making it an hour earlier, and it might be a little shorter than the last one that we had. So that will start at noon Central Time, and I think that makes it 6 o'clock UK. I know that the clocks are changing, but I think we're not there yet. So I bid you all goodbye and have a good week. Thank you.
Hi folks, I'm Alan Watt and this is Cutting Through the Matrix on August 23rd, 2020. Welcome to my world where I explain the sciences behind the system that runs pretty well everything. And at the top, of course, you have CONology, a term I coined years ago to do with the art of persuasion by the elites, using professionals to give your opinions and to fool you. And any good con, when you've all heard about confidence tricksters, it's much higher than even the confidence trickster, because confidence tricksters never work in such big teams for their stings. But what you do find is that they pick their target, and when they pick their target, the target must basically get involved in the game and consent to it. Generally, they think they're going to get something for nothing. That's how it generally works. And you can see how in 20 years, really, and before that as well, of course, with free this and free that, if you buy 2, you can get 10 and all this nonsense to do with shopping and saving. It's called mousetraps in the trade, as they call it, in public relations and marketing. And so they offer you all these little things to pull you in. And when they pull you in, they want your name, address, and phone number, your DNA and everything else, maybe even your firstborn, depends what you're getting. And you comply with it, thinking you're going to win. And it's based on winning, the game theory too, on winning, this idea that everybody's out for themselves. And they like to win. And sure enough, I've met people who are addicted to gambling. Maybe lots of you out there too may have similar experiences with people they know, and maybe even relatives. And it's a real addiction. You'll meet them. They're not into heavy drinking generally and things like that. It's just gambling. And it's the feeling that they're winning something that is their big high, and the release of tremendous endorphins, and they feel fantastic at the time they've done something. They've got value suddenly. And it's of course doesn't last long, because they've got to win again if they can, but the house never loses, as they say in gambling. It doesn't matter how, if you keep going back and back, you lose it all again, and a lot more besides that. And it really is a bad addiction. And some good books have been put out there by people who were addicted to gambling and who've got out of it with a lot of help, etc. But it shows you how it destroys their lives. And don't forget that you got to remember too, there's a whole industry based around gambling, massive industry. And you don't think about it as except what you see, like roulette tables or horses or dogs, the dog tracks and so on. But there's a massive science behind it too, to prompt the customer to the next step, the next step, and the next step, always with the lure of winning something extra. And a whole science behind it. Well, it's the same with all CONology. You are the target, and governments go to no ends using your tax money to employ people who are awfully good at what they do. Some are awful as well, mind you. They come up with children's ideas that have been done before, but they're well connected because we live in a terribly corrupt society. But these persuaders, these advanced type persuaders, understand behaviorism and psychology and consumerism, with the Bernese techniques too, that he got from his uncle, supposedly his Uncle Freud, and of how the unconscious there's a lot of drives in the unconscious to give you, again, self-worth and things like that, again, getting back to winning. and what you want to, and what you like to have. But if you've got common sense, you could never afford this, or even if you could afford it, you might not be able to afford the upkeep on a very expensive top-class Rolls-Royce or something like that, or even insurance on it, for that matter. So you don't do it. Generally you don't. So the idea is to make you really, really greedy, and through motivational techniques, because that's what the motivational people do to you, with their hand flapping on stages and run up and down, to stop you thinking for yourself, to make you feel excited, and then they sell you the idea or the product, and the idea is the product, and you buy it from them, the techniques of how to do it. But it's short-lived again. It's a very short-lived idea that you're omnipotent to an extent. You can browbeat anybody if you just scream loud enough and keep insisting and demanding. That's what most of it's really based on. And they produce an awful lot of unpleasant characters. And so we're all fed up with them. I'm sure you've met lots of salesmen like that too. And women too. Women are better at it, actually. If you look at the drug companies, they employ attractive young women and who are dressed to the nines with the best expensive clothing to go around the doctor's offices. And they drop off after having a little friendly chit-chats on first-name basis and so on. They drop off lots of free drugs to try by their drug companies for the doctors to start dishing out. Everything works on basic psychology and human nature, and you exploit it, and it works awfully well, in fact. So, getting back to CONology, everything is run by the art of CONology. Many years ago, I remember reading a book about politics, one of the many books. I was never really into, I knew it just instinctively, it was a lot of nonsense, and a technique of just managing the general public for some other group, obviously, above them. Because the people you met or you heard about us on TV weren't the brightest. They were pattern merchants, as we call them. Again, salesman types, but they were not the brightest of all. And if they were tripped up by a good reporter in a very quick interview, during what they call a flash interview on the steps of number 10 or whatever it was, or the Parliament building, they'd often quit back the wrong thing. It would get them in trouble. So they were always taught by their handlers. And the politicians, by the way, all have handlers to manage them. They even have acting lessons. Again, they put it they charge the taxpayers for their acting lessons. I did the article a few years ago on that one in Britain, and other countries do it. And of course, they're all taught again never to answer a question directly if it's sensitive at all, or if it's going to commit you to any agenda. You just ask the question you'd wished they'd ask you. That's why when you hear them getting asked straight questions, they answer back this, what are they talking about? Well, that's their wish question, you see. It's nothing to do with what was asked of them. And it's all a con. And again, the public, to even bother voting, you understand young people, they're idealistic, and I've got over the destructive phase of revolution. You'd think that they'd eventually catch on and say, wait a minute here, it's all corrupt. And you'd hope they get even further and realize that the revolutionary leaders are all corrupt as well, and they don't take from much higher powers, generally the very ones you're protesting are managing it at the top. I'm not kidding you. That's how it really works. It's a vastly different, reality is a vastly different system than what you think it is, what you're trained to think it is. And getting back to the idea of CONology, they give you new normals, and now you see a rapid introduction of new normals all the time. All the time. Years ago, I wrote poems about new normals, years and years and years ago, to come up with the term. And it's widely used since. But you'll find that the folk do adapt rather quickly now, especially under panic. You know, the herd instinct, as they call it, and the herd mentality is all aimed at the herd, at the general population. So is all kinds of warfare, and weaponry, by the way. You know, most things, they're used to persuade you to do something that perhaps you shouldn't do, the terms that Aldous Huxley talked about on his interview with Mike Wallace. He said that the techniques that they had then, in the 1950s, were effective on persuasion. persuading the public. And I said, and perhaps these techniques are so persuasive and effective that they're making people accept things that perhaps it's not in their best interest to accept. And I'm getting back, I'm still in the whole art of CONology. Because it's, again, the first thing is to give a fake reality to the general public. It's quite easy to do because you see your parents, or our parent, depends, because you're under war, remember. This is a war scenario, constant war, a changing battlefield of war all the time. Financial, with the family too involved, or the destruction of the family, or the new family is the one they call it as well. And they came out with a nuclear family, and now they have the real nuclear family, because you can see right through you, believe you me, and everything about you. That is the true nuclear family they were really talking about. So, people don't know you. You think you're growing up in your own little bubble again. In your generation, you look around you to the left and the right, and there's all the bubbles of your generation going along with you, like a straight line you see. Just ahead of you, you've got the older bubbles living in their generations, and everything that was normal to them is drifting off, and you're replacing it with your new normals, which you think you all do yourself. Somehow you think that you designed the clothing that we're. No, you didn't. Somehow you think you designed the hairstyles. No, you didn't. Somehow you think that you designed the music that was promoted, but you know you didn't, because you see, there are institutions above all these things. This is all part of the culture industry. And they decide what's going to be pushed and what isn't, you see. Do you really think that suddenly, after lots of, different music and so on, yeah, you had rock and all the rest of it, you had the glam rock until the guys were, there was more hair lacquer on them than hair, I think. And things like that. It went down the tubes, but you went right down to rap. Eventually, just angry sounds, And that was, double meanings. I talked about it years ago, about how you wrap it up. And the spoken word is awfully important. The spell is the spelling, you see. You can cast a spell by spelling. That's why the language is so was so used before by different groups and occult groups too, that run societies, and they have little winks and their nods as they talk to each other, and you get a different meaning from it. But they literally had this in the 1700s and 1800s, and movements against it. And yet people who analysed the words, awfully important. Because it meant a lot, you see. The spoken word in court is what matters when it's uttered, you see. The judge doesn't ask you to spell it. He asks you to speak it. And you're judged by every word that comes out your mouth. I think it goes way back to the Bible too. So people get confused with it. And you think of the English language, why on earth would it have so many words where one word could be spelled differently 2 or 3 times, but uttered the same way? It's different for purpose, obviously. And it actually is. They don't really need such coding today so much because they are so interwired with the encrypted programs for their own communications at the top, way beyond anything you can imagine. And it's really true enough that the folk can't imagine how far advanced all these things are today. But the spell is spelling. It casts a spell. And you get back into. So now you can also use the fact the words can mean something else on the general public when you want them to buy something. Again, the subconscious takes it a different way. You can manipulate the mind by using subconscious, or almost unconscious, but subconscious suggestions to them without them twigging onto it as to why they suddenly want to drink this brand of beer or something. A sudden urge for it. Of course, the easiest things to talk about are candies and cakes and things like that. People are very suggestible that way, very simple. But again, language is awfully important. And remember, language also can be visual. Colors are a language as well, for those who haven't figured that out as well. Colors are very important. You're living in a world that hasn't been explained to you. In fact, great pains are made to make sure that you don't really learn them as well, what's really going on. Again, Jacques Ellul, a tremendous philosopher, very straightforward and honest about things, who's deceased now, but he talked about propaganda and how you must get the children early for an initial indoctrination. Now you think about it, what are you doing? If you're in power, if you have you're part of a structure of power that manages millions of people in a nation, then what you have to do is standardize thought. If you can standardize thought, then you're pretty well guaranteed, not exactly certainly by persuasion, but pretty well guaranteed eventually you'll have a population growing up. If you continue at it, they can come to conclusions, predetermined conclusions by the rulers, what they want you to come to. It's very easy then, you see. That's why most folk around you today that really have never questioned these things, they've never really figured it out. They can't imagine how what you're talking about half the time. They really can't. They can't imagine what you're talking about. What are you talking about? They've never heard of what all these terms and these things that you say happen. They've never heard of them. And yet, here you are, you're telling it to them. And it's completely foreign to them. It's outside their ken, as they say. And they'll test it out. And so-and-so said this. You know what he said? And they'll prattle it off to them. And I say, oh, that's crazy. Because those who've never really, as nation is taken on them, if it's worked, as they say, then that's it. And their indoctrination has really worked. Their initial indoctrination worked awfully well at school. And then it's built upon through the curriculum, this drummed, or dunned, these call it dunned into them. So it's worked awfully well. Why should, I've mentioned it before, why should the tribe that you're born into, because you still think tribally in like a small tribe, even though you're in a big city or a nation with millions, you still think like a small tribe. That's your nature. It's in you. It doesn't matter what country you're in. And you take for granted as a mammal that the older ones are going to take care of you and warn you and look after you. That's how all mammals work, you see. And you expect the elders and the parents, put that way, to take care and warn you what's bad or dangerous to you. And if you don't get initial indoctrination by the parents, they'll walk right up to something that's going to eat them without any fear, you see. And that's how mammals work. Well, all the things that makes us tick, that's well studied, is what's picked apart in order to exploit us by using our nature, you see. So it's impossible for most folk to think that those at the top that you've voted in, or your parents, or your grandparents, or whoever it happens to be put in there, are not working for your best interests. It's terribly sad. But that's really how it works. It's very simple. And then when they want to have you go off to war for a few people at the top, they want resources or control over energy supplies or whatever it happens to be. They'll use the nation and they'll use the taxpayer to fund it all, so the big corporations can profit. But most folk never figure that out either. They're given, what to go to war against these people because they're the worst thing that ever hit the world since Satan, you see. And they're given very simple propaganda, because if it's too complicated, a story, it can be picked apart. So you keep it simple until you're just left with great chasms which you can't jump over. And that's how they do it. It's very simple stuff. But again, it's back to CONology. So meanwhile, when all this is going on, they're still brainwashing children at school. This is your nation, and we're all happy. They tell you that you're all happy, even though you're asked the question, Oh, you have no chance to say we're pretty sad, actually, or we're ticked off. You're told you're pretty happy, and you get all these children's books to read, you see, and completely loaded with political correctness of all kinds today, starting about the age of 5. All paid again by the taxpayer. We pay for our balls and chains. our manacles. We pay for them. Everything that shackles our brains, literally, we pay for. Big money to the guys that come up with the ideas of how to insert little bits into stories that have got nothing for children, eh? To make sure they grow up accepting all the new ideas that your masters have decided are going to be normal, new normals, you see. It's quite fascinating, isn't it, when you think about it. So getting back to what I was talking about CONology, I haven't really left it, because all I've been talking about is CONology and how you get sucked into it. You accept that which is presented to you as real, everything. You're given your opinions, and Addt'l again went through that, and others have done the same, and I've done it by bits and bytes of information that you don't really consciously think about too much. But somewhere it's assembling inside your mind. Bits and bytes just come together when a question is asked about a particular topic, and you'll just blurt out something you've heard bits and bytes of from different newscasters, just little bits and bytes, and your opinion comes out of you, and you haven't ever before this sat down and thought about it consciously and says, I think I'll choose that as my opinion. It's because it's all given to you. You're led to conclusions. You're always led to your conclusions. It's the art of persuasion. And the art of building consensus has to do with persuasion. And consensus management. You're living through it all right now with the idea of and we must all accept that for that and everything else, by the way, that they've got lined up for you. It isn't just for that one. They've got a whole range of things they want to. And they want your cooperation, in fact, even your willingness to allow it to happen. Again, CONology must make the victim participate in their deception. It's for your own good, you see. If they came up to you and said, knock, knock, knock at the door, we're from the government, we want your house from you. And you said to them, well, why? Well, it's for the greater good. We want to move you all into these tents there, because there's folk already living in those tents over there. And we want the world to be equal, and it's not really. So it'll be good for them to see that you're losing your homes, which we'll then take, you see, to put our toffs in, and then the world will be more equal at your level, you see. And things like that. You say, no, Darren, but if they can persuade you enough, they can get anything they want. Just like Monty Python, The Meaning of Life, the beginning of that particular movie. After the hospital scene with the wonderful machines that go beep, and are £2 million just for the beep itself, and very impressive little flashing lights. Whether they work or not and do anything is a different story, but that doesn't matter. And then they go on to the idea of the men driving up to get livers, if you're consenting to having organs donated, and they come for it, you see, and at the end they persuade the wife of the guy that they're just taking the liver from. To put her name down after making her feel so small and insignificant. He says, can we have your liver too then? Yeah, okay, go on then. And that's how it's done. You must participate in the con, you see. So it's to do with also belief. Part of tyranny of all kinds. You can have wonderful utopic tyrannies where you're kept in cotton wool, and you won't have a single thought or decision to make by yourself. It won't even require your thought. You'll just automatically respond Pavlovian style into your conditioning, to whatever your governors want, you see. And you go along with it that way, quite happily, to the bitter end. It's for the greater good, you see. We're all in it together. That old slogan, we're all in it together. It keeps me thinking about a long time ago. I was reading about the RAF, Royal Air Force in Britain, and you had Winston Churchill talking about we shall fight them on the beaches and all this kind of stuff. And in reality, of course, he was talking about you would be fighting them on the beaches and so on. But this is the kind of propaganda they put out for the general public to swallow. Sometimes whole teams work together. Generally, that is the case today. You seldom get anything coming out of a person from their own brain as a talking head. It's done by teams. Even the radio, most folk, even a lot of the radio that you think is actually for you, has got producers and all the rest of it, and it's all worked out and yada yada yada. But anyway, Winston Churchill's given these speeches, and the fireside chat ideas that FDR took on as well. But meanwhile, they kept a particular long range. I don't know if there were Shackletons at the time, or which were really the Lancasters, which had massive extra fuel tanks added to them, and they had a whole, basically a squadron of them, and they have two at a time with the engines going for 2 parts of the war. Sometimes for weeks on end, and then maybe a cam for a bit, and then on again. So they could rush their whole families and Winston Churchill and the government out of the country to go to Canada. So yeah, you'd be fighting on the beaches, etc. But that's how it's done, and of course Winston Churchill comes out as the great man for a war that maybe could have been averted, because there's a lot of evidence that Hitler really didn't want all the things he was accused of wanting. And I think personally, if some of them had given some of the land back that was taken from them after World War I, it might have been averted. But the reparations were guaranteed in another war. They had no option but to have another war. And some of the top observers at the treaty in Paris 1919 said the same thing. This is going to cause another war. Anyway, these things, but again, getting back to generations of people getting brainwashed, because look what happens. Look how easy it is to set up segments of society. The more differences of peoples and populations, and even ethnic groups, you can get inside a nation. And this isn't rocket science; it's old knowledge. You can certainly always stir up certain, and now even with the genders and so on, and subgenders of the subgenders, etc. You can really stir up people to be radical and start creating chaos on command pretty well if you want it to happen, especially when you supply the leaders of all these groups, and that's other key to it as well. They do. The followers seldom know that, but the ones who are following, they do it. Have you noticed that all the rioters in the States, none of them are against the mass vaccinations that are coming? Don't you think that's a bit odd? None of them are against the wars across the world. No. They get switched on and off by unseen forces, don't they? And you don't hear in them demanding the abolition of the corrupt systems of money and having the government, coin or print its own money as it's supposed to. It's all dished out to foreign groups. And a lot of them are foreign groups, actually, foreign-owned. But you don't hear them saying that or demand. No, they don't. It's very selective. Very strange anarchists today, don't you? And very strange communists, where they're getting funded by the richest corporations on the planet, hundreds of corporations, who are all part of the WEF, World Economic Forum, who are all part as well of the Great Reset powers for how they're going to run the world. And who are all part of all the global globalization structures that are. But the fact is, they don't stop and say, how come the people that you'd think we'd be protesting, but we're not protesting, how come they're the ones that are funding us all? So what are you protesting about? What are you, at the bottom line, what are you protesting about? If it's all the fault of the crooked system, and it's a crooked system way above you, a closed door policy organization at the top, how come no one's protesting that? And yet that's the groups that going to fund you to protest other things and protest destruction so they can bring in a new system. It doesn't dawn on the followers. They're just full of rage, full of absolute rage. And the rage is fostered. Again, that documentary put out by Millie Weaver there, think what you want about it. It's well produced, maybe Because you always ask yourself, who really is producing all these things? But you get insight into some of the intelligence agencies and how they work, and how government works with them, and how big corporations, the military-industrial complex, work with them too. And what you see in that too, I'll just touch on it briefly, is the fact that you got all these people at the bottom getting funded by the biggest, richest corporations on the planet, who go to the WEF, these corporations, they run it, who talk about the need to depopulate the planet, etc. They're funding folk to riot in the streets and burn places and defund the police. Well, in the documentary, and I've seen this before in other places as well, they've got some articles mentioned there, and big meetings have been happening over the last year or two. It goes way back for even further than that. Don't you understand that these corporations have already got their bids in to put robots on the streets that you're going to fund anyway? How do you fancy trying to debate with a robot when you're asked, why are you burning down this house? What do you think you're going to tell them? A robot doesn't care about your emotions or what you've suffered or anything else, or your mental state. It doesn't care. But they've got big contracts right now, and the companies have been named. This is the evolution of the military-industrial complex here, from not just this massive surveillance society that was put forth. I said, what would we do? What will we do in a post-war world? Well, we'll have to go into complete surveillance. And then what? Well, and then go into policing the world. So how do you get folk that they're, again, human beings, we're dealing back at this human being, this problem of human beings, right? They don't like changing, right? They might not like it if we just start putting robots on the street. I can remember years ago giving similar talks from the science articles when they had the K9 units, the K9, the letter K. And it was to get used to the ideas of they would take over from actual real dogs for sniffing dogs. And they'd be robots, you see. And then they showed you the little quaint little pocket-sized things that some of the guys in customs had that could sniff drugs and sniff this and sniff that. And sniff all kinds of unmentionable things, perhaps. But the fact is, they had them years ago. And all you do now is start putting it all into the robots, and put them on the streets. I think China has already put some out already. They've had articles in the last few weeks about that, and how they're expanding it. Isn't it odd that, again, we're called nations that are at loggerheads with each other, aren't we? We're all competing, we've got loggerheads, but they all do the same things at the same time, eh? That's just coincidence, though. Of course. But again, it's the easiest way to get it in is to get the people to demand you defund the police. Isn't it beautiful? Get them to demand what you want. Otherwise, in a peaceful society, they would say, I don't want them to be arguing with robots. I mean, how are you going to explain yourself to a robot? That's going to go through a whole sequence of events, and if it decides that you're raising your voice or belligerent, or is deciding that you're mentally unstable because your voice is raising, you might just get zapped or lasered or worse, you see, or tasered, or worse. So there you go. Get the people to demand it. Why will they demand it? Because, you see, once you pull the police out, you've got all these social ills that have been building up for years, with mass unemployment, mass drug taking of all kinds of stuff, getting shipped in, etc. I've been following the drugs for years and years and years and years, and it's a fascinating thing that they just couldn't stop the drugs, supposedly. And then you find that every intelligence agency and special forces has had people down Latin America and elsewhere, but in Latin America, all over the place, because that's how they get their money from their black budgets, is the drug trade, massive drug trade. So it's quite fascinating, as I say. But again, CONology. So you were supposed to sit at home, and watch these detective stories, and whether it's at CSI, as they diligently, no matter what happened to poor old the sod that lived on the street and died on this, this whole team's never going to sleep. They can't sleep worrying about this poor old sod that lived on the street and died. They're going to find out what killed him or who killed him. They're going to spend millions on that because that's what they tell you to do. Do you really believe that? Do you really, really believe that? Oh. But this is what they give you, is for reality. Complete fiction. And I mentioned it years ago too, back in the 90s. I said also, here's what they give you. Like, here's all these complaints, and I reeled off complaint departments for different social things, even social services, things that you may need. You'll think, well, maybe I won't ever need those things, whatever it is. Or help because you're stuck at home and you've been partially disabled or something, even temporarily. What do you do? Well, you got all these, So you phone up the health this and the health that, and sorry, they can't help you. You find out, I said, these are all tools that are put out there for you to use that you think are there. You're paying for them. You're paying for them through all their taxes and so on. You say, well, that's wonderful. We've got all these things that they're to help me if I'm ever in trouble. But they're rubber tools. They're rubber, because when you whack them on the road, they bounce. Just like a check, poof. They're no use to you. They're not going to do you any good. So everything sounds wonderful until you need it, you see. The general public are managed. It's the hardest thing to get through their heads, that they're actually managed. They're not managed because the agencies are there to help them. They're managed because the agencies are there to make things work on behalf of the masters who own you all. That's what he was there for. Otherwise, it would be utter chaos, you see, at times. And people don't want to believe they're getting managed, you see. Of course you're getting managed. Of course you're getting managed all the time. Your opinions are given to you. The way you behave are given to you. If you get married, don't get married is given to you. All these things are given to you. You see? A lot of what became you was given to you. I think growing up in Britain, it was way ahead of a lot of countries, with its psychological techniques embedded in plays and dramas. I think Canada followed it pretty well, because the so-called Commonwealth countries are all ex-British Commonwealth, you see. They still call them Commonwealth countries, or the Friends of the Commonwealth, because the elite took your wealth from the commoners, I think, for the whole lot of you. So they could live in big castles and things. But Britain definitely exported its techniques to Australia and Canada. France did pretty well on its own. It didn't really need the help. France is one of the first countries that really accepted a system based really on an advanced socialism that came out of, they call it Jacobinism, but it was really a form of communism. And they tried to toss out all the old systems and get rid of it entirely. That's always the same thing. When you see year zero starting, it's communism. It's the same movement, regardless of what they give you as the front people to lead it, you see. It's always the same movement. And of course, they give you new everything, including new days of the week, and even a longer week. I think they tried 10 days at a time for a new week in France at one point. And also that thing that really annoys them in France, they wanted free love and all that without the consequences. So you had, backstreet abortionists just opening up quite legally at that time to get rid of, which often killed the women as well. And also had a plague within 10 years of orphans on the streets that they had to get rid of as well. And they did too. They had ways of getting rid of them. So these things are nuisances. You always see the same thing cropping up over and over, the same darn things right up to the present day. But France did well, because if you ever watched the French movies, you haven't got a clue what's going on. I'm not talking about the language. I'm talking about the story. And they go through these almost surrealistic settings. And you'll follow it thinking, eventually it's got to get to some relevant, pertinent point, But they don't. They really don't. And you're left feeling, yuck. Very much like the British BBC ones, which at least gave you points. BBC, everything that they showed you about marriage was horrible. Horrible. Every marriage was made in hell. And the women were always nagging the men and yelling at them, and it was dysfunctional, until no one wanted to get married, you know. And the children were out of control, yada, yada, yada. But it was all done deliberately. Of course, it was part of the psychological operations that they were doing on the public for the new system. But they would promote more and more women's liberation and sexual revolution for the women during this whole period too. And of course, that's why the National Health Service, we've got to be honest about this, that was one of the main reasons that the people who brought it in, and I think the one for Canada said the same thing years ago, it was to deal with the population problem, unwanted children, etc. Unwanted was the new term. Because most children are wanted if an economic system is okay. But part of the dissuasion of having children is to use economics against people wanting children. It's well understood and actually taught in the higher sociological classes. And economists have come out with this quite openly. I mean, what do you think Malthus was initially, you know? So everyone has to have a purpose for the elite, as opposed to being a purpose for each other, you know? So you have to serve them, and again, back to CONology, you've got to believe what they tell you. It's for the common good and the greater good and all the rest of it. You have to sacrifice all the time. Whereas going off to war, you see, and they'll paint whatever enemy is with the most horrible brushes, that you really did think that you know, Lucifer or Satan has just appeared there in the shape of Osama bin Laden. Huh? And everybody else you've heard of since then. Huh? Telling you, it's quite something what you're living through. And then you had Saddam Hussein, another, this evil just reincarnates immediately into somebody else, right? And all the way to Libya, of course, and Gaddafi, and then to Syria. Non-stop, just one after the other, isn't it? And who's benefiting in America from this? It's not the people who get stiff with the bills for all. You know that. Same with Britain too. And you have these strange intelligence agencies way above. They've got nothing to do with you, apart from using you, because you see they belong to something different, completely, from what you think of protecting you. But we must always accept, again, our part in it, you know, and you go along with it. And most folks don't stop paying their taxes for all. Nope. Again, this herd mentality that's encouraged. It isn't encouraged. You know, you don't want to protest that and stop paying your tax. I can remember back in the 90s, and again, after 9/11 in 2001, certain folk here and there stopped paying their taxes. They didn't want these wars. They knew it was coming. And they had enough of it. And why should you pay taxes for things that really it's going to have such a blowback effect on all of you and destroy your nation eventually? Look at all the nations across Europe. The face of Europe is changed with mass migration and under the guise of refugees. And they haven't stopped yet. They still want Iran. Iran's been losing its population for years now, because would you wait in a country where you're told every week you're going to get bombed into the dust like Iraq? Huh? Of course you wouldn't. That's part of warfare. Forced migration by terrorizing the public, you see. It's all taught in military academies. So you must participate, as I say, in your own deception. And your hardest part in mentioning the deception, as I say, is to get through to folk around you who swallow it all, thinking it's too big to be all a lie. Huh? It's too big for all to be a lie. And yet, here you go. You are just, one of the cattle. When you realize, and they're talking openly now of just not, once they pass the euthanasia laws, they've got a next step and the next step and the next step to go, until literally they want you to just be at 65. Quite openly, some of them. Again, you're back to the meaning of life. Can we have your liver, Oh, okay, then I guess I'm so small and tiny and insignificant on you. That's what's getting done to you. And again, using the same persuaders, like Yale University, or I mentioned it before, the links I put up before. I'll make put up again, where they're again spending millions of your tax money for these professional, people who lie as a profession, using psychology and behaviorism and all the rest of it, to persuade you to accept things and to go along with the flow and do what you're told. And even to cause dissension and to get groups to turn on you if you don't wear a face, even it or whatever. These folk should be, and again I mentioned it before, a tyrant's hall of shame. And their faces should be exposed, and you add to them from the politicians that you waste your money on these swine, let's call them swine, who professionally lie to the public by using psychology and your human nature against you. Huh? Absolutely. I'm quite serious about it. You got to start naming them and add their faces to it, put them on it, I'm telling you. The tyrants, and the folk are going to profit from it, like billions and billions of dollars, and the bill are all in on it. The ones who deny any, except the ones that they've got shares in. Hey, come on here. And their whole idea that nothing's going to work except their value. Well, and they'll even tell you whether it works or not. We live under such incredible corruption. We're a herd, and they're the farmers. They see us as animals, and they see us as their animals. Our job is to be fleeced. For them. I'm quite serious about it. That's how they talk about us. Them, the little people. That's all of you. And the arrogance through years and years and generations of academia into absurd learning, absurd learning in absurd areas. The ivory tower really is just wispy. It blows in the wind up there. There's nothing to hold it grounded to anything. It's so anti-fantasia. They really believe in their superiority and their right to rule us. So again, it comes down to fear. But again, it's an evil system. You can't say it's just human nature. The scariest part for naive people who've swallowed their indoctrination is even accepting there's incredibly evil people in the world. They don't have horns, except unless they've had them implanted, and they actually do that with some people now. They implant these horns. Surgeons will do that. But do no harm. Where did that go? But they'll actually, it's really some kind of cement, with some kind of cement, a horn on your skull if you want it there. I know someone who was in a hospital in New York City, and she was a nurse, and she went on one day, and there's a guy lying in the bed with a horn on his head. And the nurses were told, don't laugh at him, don't laugh at anybody. And do you realize how hard it'd be not to kind of laugh or quip something to this guy? I couldn't have shut my face, no way, But this is where they brought society to, Because there's nothing. If you're doing something like that surgically, I don't care what you're doing. That there's definitely harm being done there, and different levels of it. It's the same with using surgery to supposedly cure mental problems. You can't do that. They tried that with lobotomies and dichotomies. It's horrible what they've done in the past, but it doesn't stop them to make money off of people who are obviously got problems, but they're not treating it the right way. Anyway, again, this is the world that we're being given to by those masters at the top, because the more dysfunctional it seems to be amongst you, the more scared they did, and it's easier to control them during this terror campaign we're going through. This is a campaign of terror, if you haven't fathomed it out, coupled with the obvious total crashing of financial systems, and even food-wise, because no one's allowed to work normally. It's all planned this way. If you want to save a system, why would you bring in this system and all the businesses, this company, a crunch, except the big corporations that are funding all the other internal, perhaps, terrorist groups? Isn't that rather coincidental? Huh? Isn't that coincidental, eh? It bores me to even talk about it. It really does. But most folk never really figure it out, unfortunately. And the ones who take the information, like the stuff I'm putting out, and then prattle it in the same week, often, you'll hear it often put out there after I do these talks, with all the links and everything else. I've done all the work, you see. You have no idea who they work for. Because I don't believe that there's anybody in politics today that's not there because they were put there. And they play their roles on their sides, you see. They play their roles. Years ago, I can remember when there were lots of alternate radio, mainly on AM and shortwave radio worldwide. Harder to get it all censored by then, although you did get certain ones who would try to censor them by having their ads withdrawn, things like that. Everything's political in this system, you see. And there's no such thing as free speech. There never really was anything. The ones who have the biggest money and run ads and campaigns and fund the politician, the ones they want in power, they got the power. The ones who got the cash, and they get what they want. But at least you had a lot of variety and people from different areas who really studied in different areas. You had technocracy, all right, but you had interviews with people who'd lived through the Cold War, big chunks of the Cold War, even from World War II onwards, with lots of experience and wisdom, who are all gone now. And but in the talks, they would add little bits. Collectively, they'd add little bits, you see, of their experiences and their insights into what happened and how the system runs and works and all that kind of thing. And lots of them realized, too, that the politics really was a scam. It goes way, it's not new, being a scam, a CONology is a system. I think Thomas Jefferson mentioned it, too. I've mentioned this part so often, where he did talk about, if you see the same agendas being continued between changes in the House, meaning the parties, if you truly had different parties, you would see really drastically different agendas, but you don't. We haven't. We've seen the same agendas, even from Papa Bush to Junior Bush. Even where Bill Clinton was in, he was lobbing cruise missiles over into Iraq and different places, destroying it for his whole time in office. And you had the Desert Storm idea, and then you had the Junior Bush, of course, 9/11. And the whole PNAC group, and then you had Obama went in afterwards, and Obama, even Obama, the name, that's not what his name was. It's not what he called himself up until then. And the main arch villain, this is a comic book, right? I'm not kidding you. I'm still waiting for someone to convince me that it's just a big coincidence that when the biggest enemy of the world at that time, supposedly the arch devil, the demon himself, archdemon, was called Osama. They put in a president and they call him Obama in America. Do you really swallow all that? Do you realize that somebody's laughing at us all? Do you realize that? Someone's having a big chuckle with all these things that are going on right now. And they are. But most folk don't question it. Wasn't that something? Wasn't it Barry Sitoro, they called him himself up until then or something? Anyway, but no one questions it. And they just present it. Going down to history books, folk in the future, if there's any folk left, that matter, who read that kind of stuff, they'll be laughing their heads off, like it's some big scam getting pulled, But anyway, Obama was then congratulated, the Democrat, the communist, so-called Socialist Communist International Group, Obama, was congratulated by the supposed PNAC group using Donald Rumsfeld, who congratulated Obama for continuing his wars. The same wars, and expanding them and even adding to them. Right? He got lots of applause from them for doing all that. Why would the so-called pretended neocon group that Rumsfeld and Bush were part of congratulate their supposed arch enemy of democracy, Democrats, or whatever you want to call them, really communists, But international socialism, as I've mentioned before, is a system the elite want for the present time to suit their efficiency. That's what it's for. Technocracy, see. It doesn't matter if you call it communism and technocracy, whatever. It's all the same thing. It's for the greater good, And the World Economic Forum, as they crash the world's economy, and for you, that is, not for themselves. They're getting richer at the top. But they're crashing the whole world's economy for all the little people out there, are bringing in their new system of efficiency. And you'll have to all be in it together, and you'll have to do what you're told in order to collectively survive. That's just the way it's done, eh? Any other person in history who did that was a tyrant, but today it's scientifically necessary, don't you understand? Huh? And the public, as usual, unfortunately, through terror and fear, because you always use terror and fear and the reign of terror to get the public to comply, to save themselves. To save themselves. It's awfully important. And remember, too, folks, that you can help me take along here, as I say, if you just donate to me and help me stay, alive, and to keep all my sites going, etc. Going to cuttingthroughthematrix.com. And remember, always make sure you've done it, because folk postpone things, eh? And until certain things happen, and then you can't get them again. And make a note on my official sites. If anything goes down, and one of them, hopefully you can get me on one of the other ones listed on cuttingthroughthematrix.com website. Remember, you can buy the books and discs I've got there. They're different. There's no point just churning out another big thick tome of history for you to waste your time on. I cut to the chase to show you the cons, right down to the language that are used upon you, to get you to think for yourself. That's the only weapon you've got, is to think for yourself. It really is. It's the hardest thing for most folks, to think for themselves. And the reason I say that is because, you see, this is your fight. Individually, this is your fight. I always knew we'd all get down to the chase when we have to make a decision personally. That's what it's about, folks. The last thing you want to hear, isn't it? Oh my goodness, I have to make a decision personally. And you do. It would always come down to this. Always. It was inevitable. And so it's your decisions that matter to you, for you, and for your soul. That's what it's about. So as I say, going to cuttingthroughthematrix.com, and I always try to get it up on the Sunday night. As I say, hopefully, if you can keep watching my stuff and reading it and so on, and listening, then you can, at the very least, have an idea of what's going on. I need to pull yourself out the mire, but even if that happened, all hell would break loose from the establishment. There is an establishment that runs the country, of course there is. And it's the same establishment that ran London, and still does to an extent, a big extent. Today, it runs the world's economic system. And it's very true, if the US was to fall down to an extent, a good part of the world will go with it, because the US was a prophecy. It was the free version one with Christopher Walken. And I think it was in the last one, they're trying to reconstruct a physical Lucifer. And eventually you saw this thing rising up out the ground, or from the ground, resurrected Lucifer, standing on a pyramid basically of bodies. And I thought at the time that represents thousands of generations of people who were born, lived and died and suffered and got used and abused and all the rest of it. And never ever, not one generation knew what was really going on. And I thought that's how we're really run, you know. We're not supposed to know what's really going on. I don't think folk realize how every nation in the world, it wasn't just Africa, has been through a lot of hell. Because in the old days in Europe, and you got to rest not long ago when you think about the feudal system, and right up into the 1700s, you're still living in a feudal system. They might have given you early, but in the politics, you like this or that. That was for the nobility and the elites and the businessmen. Majority of the public were serfs. They were bought and sold with the land. They were still bought and sold with the land, of course they were. And they still doffed the cap, as they say, and called folk, you know, oh, he's a master, you know, he's a master, the local lord or laird or whatever, oh, he's a master. And I often thought, what a demeaning thing to have to call someone as a master, you see. Really, a human being. Because it really is a class system right off the bat, isn't it? If you use the term, you're obviously down yonder at the bottom dregs, and you're elevating someone above you just because of their status or their birthright or whatever. But that doesn't ever change, and believe you me, it doesn't go away. And it's so well camouflaged today that most folk can't recognize it, even though it should be more obvious than ever. Huh? CONology. You must participate in your own deception. You must participate in giving power to others. I've mentioned this so many times before. For years and years and years, you give your power away to others by voting. It's a legality. And in some countries it's mandatory. Why do you think it's mandatory? It's because for you to be ruled, it's necessary for you to accept the fact you're going to be ruled. And the only right you have in democracy, and this is a fact, look, check it up for yourselves. Look it up and see what it means about democracy and voting when it comes to recalls for anything, on any level, even from local councils. They've had cases in Canada that went all the way up to Supreme Court, where people who ran for different offices didn't fulfill their promises. And they were told that the only right a voter has is to vote, not for what happens from the vote. That's what democracy means. That's what they literally said, that defines democracy. So any liar, and that's why most of them are liars, are going to politics, are politicians. They're psychopathic. They don't mind lying. It's a way of life with them. And for those who really rule the world, it's a natural thing to do, is to don't tell the children any truth. They see you as children, naive children, because they've kept you in the dark since you were born. And just like mushrooms, you know. But yeah, people haven't got a clue of the system in which they and again, once you're out of school, most of your indoctrination is continued through fiction. Folk prefer fiction because life's pretty nasty and rotten and boring or whatever, or even scary. And so you escape from it all by fiction. And you live vicariously, either through sports. A lot of guys watch sports because in reality they have no ability or outlet to get rid of all their frustrations. So they watch guys, like a team is just a war on a battlefield is the field, the playing field. And it's a pitch, as we call it, pitch battle, you see. And so they live out through these characters in front of them. It's a vicarious way of living. In their own lives, they're given very little power today. It's been taken away from them. They're given up to until they're afraid to even assert their own selves over anything at all. All deliberately, too. A complete war on the male as well, naturally. And to get them into this position. Everything is a battle strategy. I hope you understand you've been living through battle strategies. They don't end And they simply run into the next phase and the next phase and the next phase of whatever part of it is. And many things are going on at the same time in this particular battle. How do you get rid of the main problems? Who are your main problems? Well, to name them. Okay, how do you get rid of these ones, Take away their power from them, make them feel insecure, even tell them that the whole world's problems is theirs. That's what I've done with a lot of the males. It's ran through in school, it ran in their heads and so on. And so they're taught to even feel guilty about it for things that happen thousands of years. Nothing to do with them. Nothing at all to do with them. But that's not the intention. The intention is to make them feel weak and helpless and useless and guilty. And at the same time, with young girls from a very early age, they're telling them to be assertive, etc., etc., etc. All battle strategies. It's all done deliberately. And again, people live through it, never catching on to it. Because strategies work awfully well if you get the children young enough. And that way you disable your opponents. The ones who down the road could be your main opponents. Well, they're not there anymore. They're not there. You've eliminated them. A war on society, a war on every individual, a war on genders, a war on everything that could have worked and did work at times. Nothing works perfectly, but the fact is complete war across the board to disable everybody in society, to get society itself collectively disabled. That's warfare. This is all warfare. Awfully effective. I'm not just making this stuff up. I've looked at the techniques for long-term and long-range warfare. And they have some, which can scare you with some nations that are at war at the moment. And how they've looked at that their opponents, right down to the children that are getting born, to eliminate them. So they target women in those countries. Because they breed the boys that are going to be the problem down the road. They're going to fight certain nations and so on. It's just astonishing what you read, and it's horribly effective. I mean, horribly, when you see it's actually been done for years and it's still ongoing. And this is taught as battle strategy. So when you look at your own nations and you see this long-term goal to eliminate opponents, and then put in others it's been well known through the incredible studies that have been done on genders. Women are more apt to go along and try something new in changing society if it's given to them by superior authority. You see? And so if you put experts behind folks, they're more apt to follow that and go along with it. And that's why you see so many today being placed, by the way, in charge of different functions in nations, especially during a phase of massive change. It's not coincidental, by the way. And most of them are openly what they think is, they'll say they're socialist, but they'll go with the wind, and they do like to feather their own nest as well as they go along. So it's not for ideological purposes. Everything's a sham, really, isn't it? Everything's a complete sham. But the last folk who must figure this out are the public themselves, because the war is always on the public, and it's subdivided into different sections and groups of the general public, and ages too, of course. So again, you got to stop participating in deception, your own deception.
I lock myself away and not face one more day on the streets of this town. And all I got to lose is a feeling called the blues and a little old frown. I signed your dotted line and did my best to try and give all I could give. And all I've gotten back is this feeling that I like what I'm needing to live. see it when a grown man starts to cry. You turn your face away and you walk on by. I found myself a girl who brightened up my world from December to May, and then ran off with Jim. But I defer to him and his purple beret, 'cause he knows how to wheel and deal and not to feel when he's knocking you down. And I know he'll succeed, 'cause that's just what you need on the streets of this town. And you say you don't see it when a grown man starts to cry. You turn your face away and you walk on by. And not face one more day on the streets of this town. And all I've got to lose is this feeling called the blues that's been going around. I fit your crazy norm and wore your uniform where you told me to go, and got back in return this here feeling that I've learned what the Indians know. And you say you don't see it when a grown man starts to cry. You turn your face away and you walk on